On their 10th wedding anniversary, she expected love, laughter, and forever. Instead, he stood before 57 guests and exposed her deepest wounds, turning her celebration into humiliation. The crowd laughed. She didn't. She simply walked away and returned, holding a small, beautifully wrapped box. The room fell silent. His hands trembled as he opened it, and in that moment, everything changed. What he found inside didn't just silence the room, it rewrote their story. Because that night wasn't the end, it was the beginning of her rise. Hi, my beautiful family. Welcome back to our family channel, Mr. Peter Stories. Binta's birthday is near, and she asked me to let our family choose her celebration meal. So tell us, which food should we enjoy on her special day? The dish that gets the most love in the comments will be our choice. May the Almighty bless every home with peace, every table with laughter, and every heart with love that never fades. May your days be bright, your worries light, and your families always surrounded by harmony and joy. If your heart is true, like the video. If your love is real, write, I am with Mr. Peter. Some women break when their world shatters. Others discover that broken things can have the sharpest edges. The ballroom glittered like the inside of a jewelry box, all crystal and gold leaf and elegance that whispered old money. 57 guests filled the space with champagne-soaked laughter, celebrating what they believed was a love story for the ages. Catalina Jason stood near the head table in a gown the color of champagne bubbles. Her dark hair swept into an elaborate arrangement, feeling the weight of every eye that occasionally drifted her way. The anniversary cake towered beside her like a monument to lies, each crystallized sugar flower a testament to the decade she had spent becoming invisible in her own marriage. Richard Walker rose from his seat with the confidence of a man who had never been truly challenged. His hand wrapped around a microphone. He looked exactly like what he was, someone who believed the world bent to accommodate his desires. The guests applauded as he cleared his throat, and Catalina felt her spine straighten with an instinct that had everything to do with survival. Thank you all for being here tonight, Richard began, his voice smooth as aged whiskey. 10 years ago I married this woman, and what a journey it's been. The guests murmured approval, raising glasses. Catalina's fingers tightened around her champagne flute. She knew what was coming. She had known for months. That knowledge sat in her chest like a stone she had swallowed deliberately. Marriage is about partnership, Richard continued, clicking a remote control that made the massive screens flicker to life. It's about sharing your life, your struggles, your most intimate moments. The first image appeared. Catalina heard the collective intake of breath. There she was on screen, sobbing in their bathroom, her face swollen, her body curled over the toilet as she hemorrhaged the third pregnancy that would never become a child. She remembered that night with perfect clarity. She had called for Richard, screaming his name between sobs, and he had stood in the doorway, recording her disintegration. My wife has always been emotional, Richard said, with false sympathy. Fragile, really. So many disappointments over the years. The screen changed. Now it showed her at a business dinner, stumbling, her words slurring as she knocked over a wine glass. What the video didn't show was Richard refilling her glass repeatedly, pushing drink after drink until the room spun. Catalina has struggled with stability, Richard announced. I've tried to help her, but you can't save someone who doesn't want to be saved. Another video showed her having a panic attack, hyperventilating on their bedroom floor after she found evidence of his affairs. When she couldn't breathe, he had filmed that too. Tonight, I want to be honest, Richard said, his voice carrying enjoyment. My wife has been decorative, certainly, present at events that mattered, but let's not pretend she's been a partner. Let's not pretend she's contributed anything beyond looking appropriate on my arm. The guests shifted uncomfortably. Catalina remained perfectly still, her face a mask that had taken years to perfect. Inside, she felt nothing but cold clarity. In fact, Richard continued, I think we should all raise a glass to Catalina. To the woman who managed to be a disgrace, even when all she had to do was stand there and smile. Shocked silence fell over the room. Someone dropped a fork. Richard's mother covered her mouth, but made no move to stop her son. Catalina set down her champagne flute with precision. She turned slowly, letting her gaze sweep across faces of people who had smiled to her face while knowing what her husband thought of her. Then she looked at Richard and let him see her smile. "Thank you, darling," she said, her voice carrying through the room like a bell. "That was quite the performance. I particularly enjoyed the editing. You always did have a talent for manipulation." She walked away from the head table, her heels clicking against marble in a rhythm that sounded like a countdown. The guests watched, probably assuming she was fleeing. She disappeared through doors to the private suite where she had left something behind. Something wrapped in silver paper with a white bow. When she returned carrying the box, the room had dissolved into uncomfortable conversation. Richard stood looking triumphant, accepting congratulations from associates already calculating advantages. His mistress at table 7 wore a smile, suggesting she thought she'd won something. Catalina placed the gift box before Richard with enough force to sound like a judge's gavel. Conversations died. The room held its breath. "You forgot to open your anniversary present," she said. Richard's smile faltered before he recovered, reaching for the box with careless confidence. He tore through silver paper, lifting the lid with a flourish. The smile died on his face as if someone had cut its throat. Inside lay documents, flash drives, photographs and recordings stacked with courtroom precision. Richard's hands shook as he lifted the first document, eyes scanning words that drained color from his face. Catalina began distributing copies to tables, her movements unhurried. "That's the forensic accounting report showing how you've stolen from me," Catalina said conversationally. "Every forged signature, every illegal transfer, every penny of my inheritance you funneled into hidden accounts. My investigators were very thorough." Richard stood abruptly. "You can't. The flash drives contain recordings of your conversations with my sister Elise," Catalina continued, cutting through his protest. "Every plan you made together, every laugh about my pain, every moment you thought you were clever enough to destroy me without consequences." She pulled out a photograph and held it up. Richard and Elise tangled together in bed. Several guests gasped. Richard's mother made a wounded sound. "But this," Catalina said, pulling out a medical report, "this is my favorite. Your fertility analysis from college. It confirms you're sterile, Richard. You've been sterile since you had mumps, which means you always knew you could never give me children." The room erupted, but Catalina's voice cut through chaos. "You made me believe my body was broken. You put me through years of treatments that destroyed my health while knowing the entire time that you were the problem. You let me blame myself for every miscarriage, every failed attempt, every shattered hope. You filmed my grief and called it weakness when you engineered my suffering." Richard's face went from pale to purple. "You vindictive—" "I'm not finished," Catalina said, and something in her tone stopped him. She pulled out the final document. "This is the police report I filed this morning, detailing your fraud, forgery, conspiracy to commit financial abuse. The detectives are outside waiting. I told them to let me have this moment first." She paused, letting that settle like a shroud. "I've known about everything for months. Every affair, every lie, every crime. I've spent that time documenting it all, building a case so airtight your expensive lawyers won't find a single crack. I've been playing the broken wife while methodically destroying every escape route." Richard lunged toward her with violence written across his face. He grabbed her arm hard enough to leave bruises, yanking her toward him. "You think you can destroy me? I'll bury you." 3 security guards pulled him off before he finished. Every guest had phones out now, recording Richard Walker, revealing exactly what he was beneath expensive suits. He fought like a wild animal, screaming obscenities, while Catalina stood perfectly still, photographing the bruises already forming. "That's assault," she said calmly, "in front of 57 witnesses. I believe that should make the charges stick nicely, Police officers entered through main doors, radios crackling. Richard saw them and went still, reality finally penetrating his rage. "You can't do this," he whispered. "I already have," Catalina replied, stepping back as officers moved forward with handcuffs gleaming under chandeliers. She watched them read his rights, watched him try to maintain dignity as they secured his wrists, watched him search for someone who might defend him and find only shocked faces and phones capturing his destruction. As they led him toward doors, Richard twisted around. His face was a battlefield of emotions, rage, disbelief, hatred, and underneath it all, fear. "This isn't over," he said, sounding like both threat and prayer. Catalina smiled then. And it was the most terrifying thing anyone in that room had ever seen. "Oh, darling," she said softly. "For you, everything is over. For me, it's only just beginning." The doors closed behind Richard with a sound like a coffin lid, and Catalina turned back to face her guests with her head held high, waiting to see which of them would be brave enough to meet her eyes. Chapter 2. The Unmasking. The guests scattered like insects exposed to sudden light, making excuses that crumbled under their own weight. Catalina watched them flee with detached interest, noting which ones paused at the door to glance back and which ones couldn't escape fast enough. The catering staff moved through the abandoned ballroom, collecting glasses and plates, eyes carefully averted. They didn't understand that she had never felt more powerful than standing alone in that ruined celebration, surrounded by debris of a life she had systematically demolished. Her phone vibrated. A message from an unknown number contained only an address and a time. John Copeland was finally ready to meet face-to-face after months of communicating through encrypted channels. She had expected this. Once she pulled the trigger on Richard's destruction, John would emerge from shadows where he'd been orchestrating his own revenge. Catalina left without looking back, passing mirrors that reflected a woman who looked nothing like the broken creature Richard tried to create. The drive to her penthouse took her through streets that glittered with nightlife, pretending the world was full of possibility instead of people who destroyed everything they touched. The penthouse was bought with money Richard didn't know she had, through trust funds her grandfather established before she was born. The old man had seen something in Richard that her parents missed, had written provisions, keeping certain assets completely separate. She learned about these accounts the same day she learned about Richard's betrayal, sitting in a lawyer's office while he explained she was far wealthier than her husband imagined. She poured whiskey that cost more than most monthly rents and stood at windows overlooking the city. Her reflection showed bruises blooming on her arm where Richard grabbed her, and she photographed them again, adding images to files that would ensure he never breathed free air. Her phone rang at midnight exactly. "Did you enjoy the show?" she answered. "I enjoyed watching him realize he'd underestimated you," John Copeland replied, his voice carrying rough edges from years of suppressed rage. "But we both know tonight was just the opening act. The address you sent. I assume you'll be there? I've been waiting for hours. We have a lot to discuss. What we've done so far is nothing compared to what comes next." She hung up without goodbye because there was nothing left to say until they were face to face. The address led her to an industrial building in a neighborhood most avoided after dark. She parked in shadows and walked toward the entrance, hand wrapped around pepper spray. The door opened before she could knock. John Copeland wasn't handsome. In conventional ways, Richard was handsome. He was harder, all sharp angles and controlled intensity, his face marked by lines that spoke of sleepless nights. He was tall enough that she had to tilt her head, and his eyes were winter storms, cold and calculating and completely focused on her. "You're late," he said, stepping aside to reveal a space converted into something between office and war room, with maps and photographs covering every surface. "I was busy destroying my husband," she replied, walking past him to examine walls covered with evidence of Richard's crimes beyond what she'd discovered. You've been thorough. I've had years. You've had months. The fact that you coordinated tonight proves you're exactly what I thought you were. And what's that? John moved to stand beside her, close enough that she felt heat despite cool air. Someone who understands that some men don't deserve mercy. Someone who knows the difference between justice and revenge and doesn't care. Catalina studied a photograph of Richard with another woman outside a hotel. You said on the phone that we'd only begun. What did you mean? I meant putting Richard in jail is satisfying, but not enough. He didn't build his empire alone. There are dozens of men who helped him, who profited from his crimes, who enabled everything he did. They're all still out there, still destroying lives, still believing they're untouchable. You want to go after all of them. I want to burn their world until there's nothing but ashes, but I can't do it alone. I need someone with your particular talents, someone who understands how these men think, because she survived one. Catalina turned to face him fully, searching for the trap. Why me? You have resources, investigators, money. Why do you need someone you've never met? John reached out slowly, touching bruises on her arm. Because I've been fighting this fight for years and gotten nowhere. Every time I get close, they protect each other. But you walked into a room full of Richard's allies and tore him apart in front of witnesses. You made them afraid. That's the weapon I've been missing. You want to use my rage as a battering ram. I want to partner with you to destroy the system that enabled your suffering. And in the process, make sure my wife's death actually meant something. She pulled her arm away, not because it hurt, but because she couldn't afford to trust gentleness in his eyes. What's your wife's name? Isabel. She was a photographer. Richard seduced her because she had access to properties he wanted to acquire. He got her addicted to pills, turned her into someone I didn't recognize, and when she threatened to expose him, she died in a hotel room from an overdose. The official story was that she was alone, but I know Richard was there. I know he watched her die. You couldn't prove it. He paid off everyone who mattered. By the time I understood what happened, evidence was buried too deep to recover. Catalina absorbed this, fitting it into her picture of Richard's depravity. How did you find me? I've been watching Richard for years. When your parents died and you inherited everything, I knew he'd make his move. I had investigators tracking his financial crimes when they discovered he was planning something for your anniversary. I reached out. The email. The one that told me to check Richard's safe. John nodded, pulling out a file with her name. I couldn't give you everything because you would have thought I was insane. But I could give you enough to start looking, and I knew once you started, you'd find the rest. You gambled that I'd be smart enough and angry enough to weaponize what I found. I gambled that you were tired of being his victim. Catalina picked up her file, flipping through pages detailing her life from an outsider's perspective. Seeing her marriage laid out like evidence made her feel violated and validated simultaneously. There's something else, John said quietly. Something I didn't want to tell you over email. She found it near the back, hospital records and police reports from the night her parents died. Her hands started shaking. By the time she reached the mechanic's report about brake lines, tears blurred her vision. He murdered them, she whispered. He cut their brake lines himself. My investigators found the mechanic he paid to dispose of original parts. The man's dying now, willing to testify. He says Richard came bragging about it, about getting rid of the only people who saw through him. Catalina sank into a chair, the file slipping from her fingers. They were going to make him sign a prenuptial agreement. Mother told me the week before they died. They'd hired attorneys to audit his dealings. They were going to force his hand or end the marriage. So he ended them instead. Rage filled her chest until she thought her ribs might crack apart. Does anyone else know? Just us and the mechanic. The detectives who investigated were paid off. I have proof of payments, but they'll claim it was for other work unless we tie it directly to your parents' case. Then we tie it. We make them testify. We make everyone involved pay. John knelt before her chair, hands resting on the arms without touching her. You need to understand what you're signing up for. Going after Richard was easy. He's one man. What comes next is taking on an entire network of people with unlimited resources who've spent decades protecting each other. I don't care how many there are. They helped murder my parents. They enabled every crime Richard committed. They're all guilty. Then we're partners? She met his eyes and saw the hollow place where mercy used to live. We're partners. But I need to know what you want from this. Is it just revenge for Isabel? John's jaw tightened. When he spoke, his voice carried wounds that never healed. I want them to feel what she felt when Richard watched her die. I want them to understand there are consequences for destroying innocent people. And I want to burn this corrupt system so no one else has to lose someone they love to men who believe they're above the law. That's quite an agenda, says the woman who orchestrated her husband's arrest at their anniversary party. Despite everything, Catalina felt herself smile. I suppose we're both committed to the dramatic approach. The question is whether you're ready to go all the way, because once we start this, there's no turning back. We destroy them, or they destroy us. There's no middle ground. Catalina stood, forcing John to back up, and began gathering scattered pages. Richard destroyed my body with forced miscarriages. He destroyed my mind with gaslighting. He destroyed my family by murdering my parents. He tried to destroy my soul by making me believe I deserved it. The only thing he didn't destroy was my capacity for vengeance, and that's going to be his greatest regret. So that's a yes. She handed him the reconstructed file and locked eyes with him in silent promise. That's a declaration of war. Show me everyone on your list and I'll show you how to make them bleed. John pulled out his phone. 3 laptops around the room came to life, screens filling with photographs and names and crimes stretching back decades. Welcome to the revolution, Catalina. Let's burn it all down. As she studied faces of men who thought themselves untouchable, Catalina felt something settle in her chest that might have been peace, if peace could be forged from fury. Richard was just the first domino to fall, and she was going to enjoy watching every single one topple until there was nothing left standing but her. Chapter 3. The Sisters' Reckoning. The knock came at dawn, when the sky bled pink and orange like an open wound. Catalina had been awake for hours, sitting in darkness, with files spread across every surface, memorizing faces of men who profited from Richard's cruelty. She knew without checking who stood in her hallway. The desperate rhythm of knuckles against wood told her everything. Elise looked like something dragged from a nightmare, blonde hair tangled and unwashed. Designer maternity clothes wrinkled from being slept in, face swollen from crying. She was visibly pregnant, belly swollen with Richard's child, and the sight made Catalina's stomach turn. This was the sister she had protected from childhood bullies, the sister she had loved with unconditional devotion that now felt like the worst betrayal she had inflicted on herself. "Please," Elise whispered, voice raw. "Please let me explain." Catalina stepped aside without speaking, gesturing her into the penthouse with cold courtesy. The door closed with a soft click that sounded too final. She watched Elise collapse onto the white sofa, leaving wrinkles that would require professional cleaning. "I didn't come to make excuses," Elise said, hands wrapped protectively around her stomach. "I came to tell you the truth, all of it. Everything you don't know yet. I know enough. I know you seduced my husband on my wedding night. I know you've been his mistress for a decade. I know you helped him steal from me. What else could possibly matter?" Elise flinched, as if each word was a physical blow. "You don't know why. You don't know how it started or what Richard promised." "I don't care why," Catalina interrupted, voice sharp enough to draw blood. "There is no why. That excuses what you did. You helped him murder our parents, Elise. You gave him the keys to their car the night he cut their brake lines." Color drained from Elise's face so quickly, Catalina thought she might faint. "I didn't know," Elise gasped, hands going to her throat. "I swear to you, I didn't know what he was planning. He told me he just needed to borrow the keys to move their car for some surprise. I thought, You didn't think at all. You never do. You just take what you want without considering who gets destroyed. That's always been your way. Elise surged to her feet with surprising strength. You're right. You're absolutely right. I've been selfish and terrible, and I destroyed everything good in my life because I was jealous of you. Are you satisfied? Is that what you wanted to hear? I want to hear how it felt when you climbed into bed with my husband on the night I married him, when I was downstairs saying goodbye to guests and believing I was starting a life with someone who loved me. The slap came faster than Catalina expected, Elise's palm connecting with her cheek hard enough to snap her head sideways. They stood frozen in the aftermath, both shocked it had finally come to this. He didn't love you, Elise said, voice breaking. He never loved you. He told me that night that you were a means to an end, that he needed your family's connections and money, but you made his skin crawl. He said you were cold and boring, and he needed someone who actually wanted him. Catalina's hand moved to her burning cheek. And you believed him. You actually believed that justified betraying me. I believed him because I wanted to, because you always had everything. The better grades, the prettier face, the inheritance that mattered. Mother and father loved you more, and everyone knew it. When Richard showed interest in me, I grabbed onto it because it was the first time anyone chose me over you. So this is about childhood jealousy? About feeling second best? You destroyed our family because you thought I got more attention? Elise sank back onto the sofa, pregnancy making the movement awkward. I destroyed our family because I'm weak and vindictive, and I convinced myself you deserved it. Every time Richard came to my bed after leaving yours, I told myself I was taking back something you stole from me. But you never stole anything. You were just yourself, and I hated you for it. Catalina moved to windows, putting distance between herself and the stranger wearing her sister's face. Richard has recordings of you. Did you know that? He filmed you together, recorded conversations where you laughed about my miscarriages. Hours of evidence showing your willing participation in every crime he committed against me. He told me he deleted those. He promised they were just for his private collection. Richard is a liar. Surely even you figured that out by now. Silence fell between them like snow, burying everything underneath. Elise's breathing became ragged, tears streaming down her face. He's going to use those recordings against you in court, Catalina continued, tone clinical. His lawyers will argue that you manipulated him, that you seduced him deliberately to gain access to my inheritance. They'll paint you as the mastermind, and Richard will walk away claiming he was the victim. But that's not true. He pursued me. He planned everything. Do you have proof? Any evidence at all that Richard initiated the affair? Elise's silence was answer enough. She wrapped her arms around herself and rocked slightly. What do I do? You do what you should have done from the beginning. You tell the truth, every ugly piece of it. You testify against Richard, provide evidence of his planning and manipulation, and you accept whatever punishment comes. He'll destroy me. His lawyers will make me look like a prostitute who got pregnant on purpose. My life is already over. Catalina felt something crack inside her chest, some last piece of sisterly affection splintering. Your life isn't over, but your comfortable delusion that you're innocent is finished. You helped murder our parents, Elise. You participated in my abuse. Those are facts you have to live with, not problems I'm going to solve for you. I'm begging you, please. I'll do anything, testify anywhere, give you any evidence you need. Just don't abandon me completely. I can't do this alone. You should have thought about that before you opened your legs for my husband on my wedding night. Elise stood, moving toward Catalina with hands outstretched. I know I don't deserve forgiveness, but this baby, your niece or nephew, doesn't deserve to pay for my mistakes. That child grows up knowing actions have consequences. That's a lesson you clearly never learned. What do you want from me? Blood, suffering. Tell me what I have to do to make this right. Catalina turned back to her files, picking up a photograph. I want you to go to John Coupland's office. I'll send the address. I want you to sit with his investigators and tell them everything you know about Richard. Names, dates, crimes, conversations, everything he ever told you or made you do. And then? And then you check yourself into a rehabilitation facility that specializes in trauma recovery. Not because you deserve help, but because that baby deserves a mother who isn't destroyed by guilt. You're going to spend months taking responsibility and figuring out how to be a human being instead of a parasite. You're not going to forgive me, are you? Catalina looked at her sister and saw someone she had loved before betrayal poisoned everything. I might eventually forgive you, but I'll never forget what you did, and I'll never trust you again. You'll always be the sister who chose my husband over me, who laughed about my pain, who helped murder our parents. That's your legacy. You have to find a way to live with it. Elise moved toward the door, like someone walking through deep water. She paused with her hand on the doorknob, looking back. For what it's worth, I'm sorry. I know that means nothing now, but I need you to know I understand what I destroyed. I'll spend the rest of my life wishing I could take it back. Wishes are for children who still believe in fairness. We're both too broken for that now. After Elise left, Catalina stood in her empty penthouse, feeling the weight of family ties severed cleanly. She had expected to feel victorious, to savor her sister broken and begging. Instead, she just felt hollow, as if revenge had carved out something essential. Her phone buzzed with an incoming call from an unknown number. Something in her gut warned her to let it go to voicemail, but curiosity won. "Miss Jason," a male voice said, professional and threatening. "My name is Lawrence Thorne. I represent several of Richard Walker's associates, and we'd like to arrange a meeting to discuss your recent actions. I don't discuss legal matters with strangers who call at dawn. I think you'll want to hear what I have to say. My clients are prepared to make you a generous offer in exchange for your cooperation. Shall we say lunch today? Somewhere public where you'll feel safe." Catalina felt her pulse quicken. "What makes you think I'm interested in resolving anything quietly?" "Because the alternative is a war you can't win. My clients have resources you can't imagine. What happened at your anniversary party was entertaining, but it's time for adults to step in and clean up the mess. Is that a threat?" "It's a reality check. 1 o'clock at Marchand's. Come alone or don't come at all." The line went dead. She immediately called John, who answered on the first ring. "They contacted you," he said without preamble. "You knew they would. I knew they'd try to intimidate you. It's their standard playbook. They'll offer you money to drop charges, and when you refuse, they'll escalate to direct attacks." "What do I do?" "You go to the meeting with a recording device and let them incriminate themselves. And you remember you're not alone. Every threat they make against you is a threat against our alliance, and I don't respond well to threats." After hanging up, Catalina stared at morning light filtering through her windows. Richard's arrest had been the easy part. What came next would require patience and willingness to become something darker than she'd imagined. But as she looked at files spread across her living room, at faces of men who thought themselves untouchable, her resolve hardened into something unbreakable. They wanted a war? She would give them annihilation. Chapter 4. The Alliance Deepens. Marchand's was where power lunches decided fates without raising voices. Catalina arrived precisely on time, wearing navy that suggested authority, hair pulled back in a style that said she wasn't interested in being decorative. The recording device John's team provided sat against her skin like a second heartbeat. Lawrence Thorne stood when she approached, hand extended as if they were old friends. He was exactly what she expected, silver-haired, immaculate, his smile carrying the warmth of a shark circling prey. She had seen that look before on Richard's face, that blend of contempt and desire powerful men wore when they encountered women they believed they could control. "Ms. Jason," he said, gesturing to the seat across from him. "Thank you for coming." "I wasn't sure you would. You threatened me," Catalina replied, settling into the booth. "That tends to capture attention. I prefer to think of it as clarifying the stakes. Sometimes people make emotional decisions without fully understanding consequences." I'm here to provide context. A waiter appeared. Catalina asked for sparkling water, while Thorne ordered the most expensive wine without looking at the price. Power plays meant to establish hierarchy before negotiations even began. Let's skip the pleasantries, Catalina said. Tell me what your clients want, and I'll tell you why they're not going to get it. Thorne's smile widened, as if she'd said something delightfully naive. My clients are men of considerable influence who've built success through careful partnerships. Your husband was part of that network, and his current situation creates complications. They're prepared to compensate you generously for dropping all charges and allowing this matter to be resolved privately. How generously? And $50 million in a structured settlement, plus the penthouse you're living in, plus a portfolio of properties providing substantial passive income. All you do is sign a comprehensive non-disclosure agreement and disappear somewhere tropical for a few years while memories fade. Catalina took a slow sip of water, letting silence stretch until it became uncomfortable. Your clients are idiots. If they think I can be bought off with money, I could acquire myself by pressing charges. Richard stole my entire inheritance. $50 million is insultingly low. Then name your price. My clients are motivated to resolve this quickly. There is no price. I want Richard to pay for murdering my parents. I want everyone who helped him to answer for their crimes. I want the entire corrupt system that enabled his abuse to burn, until there's nothing but ashes. You can't buy that. The mask of courtesy slipped, revealing something harder. You're making a mistake. The men I represent have resources you can't imagine. They own judges and police commissioners and journalists who'll destroy your reputation until you wish. You'd taken the money. Are you threatening to abuse legal processes to harm me because I won't drop legitimate criminal charges? That sounds like obstruction of justice. I'm sure the district attorney would be interested in hearing about this conversation. Thorne's expression shifted from condescending to coldly furious. You think recording this protects you? My clients have been playing this game since before you were born. Whatever evidence you think you have, whatever alliance you've formed with John Coupland, it won't save you when they decide you're too much trouble. So you do know about John. That's interesting. How long have you been watching me? Long enough to know you're in over your head. Coupland is a bitter man nursing decade-old grudges, using you as a weapon. When they're finished with you, he'll discard you like the tool you are. Catalina leaned forward, voice dropping to barely above a whisper. Tell your clients that I'm not a tool, and I'm not afraid. Tell them I have evidence of crimes that would put them all in prison for life, and I'm prepared to release every piece if anything happens to me or anyone I care about. Tell them Richard was just the beginning. You're signing your own death warrant. I'm declaring war. There's a difference. She stood to leave, and Thorne's hand shot out to grab her wrist with force that made bones grind. Sit down. We're not finished. We are finished. And you just gave me assault on camera. Thank you for that. Catalina pulled free with a sharp twist John's security team had taught her, leaving Thorne looking shocked she hadn't cowered. She walked away, feeling every eye tracking her exit, knowing by tomorrow rumors would spread like wildfire. Her phone buzzed before she reached her car. John's name appeared with a simple message. They're escalating faster than expected. Meet me at the estate. We need to adjust strategy. The drive to John's estate took her through neighborhoods growing progressively more exclusive until houses disappeared behind walls and gates. His property sat at the end of a private road, surrounded by security that would make most politicians jealous. The house was modern and stark, all glass and steel and clean lines. And when John met her at the door, his expression told her the situation was worse than anticipated. They're moving faster than I expected, he said, leading her into an office that looked more like a military command center. Multiple monitors displayed news feeds and financial data. While you were at lunch, 3 different media outlets published stories questioning your mental stability. They're claiming you fabricated evidence against Richard because you couldn't accept he wanted a divorce. That's absurd. There are dozens of witnesses who saw what he did at the anniversary party. They're spinning it as a breakdown, saying you staged the whole thing to humiliate him publicly because you're unstable and vindictive. They've got experts talking about how women sometimes fabricate abuse claims when relationships end. It's coordinated character assassination. Catalina felt rage building in her chest. They're using my grief against me, making my pain into evidence of insanity. That's exactly what they're doing. And it gets worse. They've filed emergency motions to have all evidence you collected thrown out, claiming you obtained it illegally through stalking and invasion of privacy. Richard's legal team is arguing everything you did was criminal harassment. Can they make that stick? John gestured to a monitor showing legal documents. They've got judges in their pocket who might be willing to entertain the argument long enough to create doubt. That's their strategy. Delay the trial, destroy your credibility, hope public opinion turns against you enough that prosecutors decide pursuing the case isn't worth it. So what do? We stop playing defense and go on the attack. I've had investigators digging into every one of Thorne's clients. We've found connections that go beyond what Richard did. These men have been running a systematic scheme for years, targeting vulnerable people and stripping them of assets through fraud. Richard wasn't the exception. He was the rule. John pulled up files, and Catalina moved closer to read details of crimes that made Richard's abuse look almost pedestrian by comparison. Men who bankrupted elderly people through predatory loans. Men who staged accidents to collect insurance money. Men who destroyed businesses to acquire property at fractions of value. Each file represented lives ruined by calculated cruelty. How do we expose all of this without getting buried under their legal assault? We give everything to journalists who aren't on their payroll. I've got contacts at 3 major publications who've been investigating this network for years, but couldn't get witnesses to go on record. You're the first victim who's fought back publicly, which makes you the perfect centerpiece for a story they can't suppress. They'll come after me even harder once those stories publish. John turned to face her fully, and something in his expression made her heart stutter. That's why you're staying here. My security team is the best money can buy, and this estate is basically a fortress. They can't touch you here. I can't just move into your house. People will talk, claim we're having an affair, use that to discredit everything. Let them talk. Your safety matters more than reputation management. My reputation is all I have left. Richard took everything else. John crossed the distance in 2 strides, his hands cupping her face with surprising gentleness. Your reputation is not all you have. You have strength they can't break. You have intelligence they can't match. You have rage they can't contain, and you have me, for whatever that's worth. Catalina felt her breath catch, trapped between the urge to lean into his touch and terror of trusting anyone after Richard's betrayal. Why are you helping me? And don't tell me it's just about Isabel. There's something else. You want the truth? Always? John's thumbs brushed across her cheekbones in a gesture that felt far too intimate. When I first started watching you, I saw a victim who needed saving. But the night of your anniversary party, when you stood in that ballroom and destroyed him in front of everyone, I realized I'd been completely wrong. You're not a victim. You're a force of nature that was temporarily contained, and watching you break free was the most magnificent thing I've ever witnessed. That's quite a confession. I'm not finished. I'm also helping you, because somewhere between tracking your movements and reading your journals, my investigators stole from your house. I fell in love with the woman you're becoming. Not the broken wife Richard tried to create, but the avenging angel who decided pain could be weaponized. Catalina stepped back from his touch, mind reeling. You read my journals? You invaded my privacy the same way Richard did? I'm not apologizing for it. I needed to know who you were before I risked everything to help you. But yes, I crossed lines I shouldn't have. What did you read that made you think I was worth loving? John smiled, and it transformed his face from harsh to heartbreaking. I read about a woman who blamed herself for every miscarriage, who thought her body was broken because that's what Richard told her. And I read about the day you discovered he'd been lying, and how that knowledge didn't break you, but forged you into something harder. How could I not love that? Love is what got me into this mess. Love made me blind to Richard's nature. That wasn't love. That was manipulation. What I'm offering you is partnership between equals who understand that some wounds never heal. They just scar over and become part of your armor. Catalina wanted to argue, wanted to push him away and maintain emotional distance that felt like safety. But standing in his office surrounded by evidence of crimes, looking into eyes that saw her as powerful instead of pathetic, she felt something crack in the walls around her heart. I'm not ready for this. I know. I'm not asking you to be ready. I'm asking you to let me help you survive what comes next. If something more develops between us, we'll deal with it then. But right now, you need to pack a bag and move into the guest wing before Thorne's clients escalate from legal attacks to physical ones. You really think they'd hurt me? I think they've killed before when people threatened their empire. I'm not taking chances with your safety. The weight of that settled over her, and she realized she had crossed a threshold where there was no turning back. She thought about her empty penthouse, about constant fear that someone might break in. Then she looked at John and saw someone who understood that fear. I'll need to get things from my apartment. Already done. My team moved everything while you were at lunch. Your clothes, files, personal items. They're waiting in the guest wing. You presumed I'd agree. I hoped you'd be smart enough to accept help when offered. Despite everything, Catalina felt a laugh escape. Something bitter that sounded nothing like joy, but was the closest she'd come to genuine amusement since her wedding night. You're very sure of yourself. I'm sure of you. There's a difference. He led her through halls decorated with art, suggesting wealth but not warmth, until they reached a wing prepared for her arrival. Her clothes hung in the closet, organized exactly how she preferred. Her files sat on the desk, arranged perfectly. Even photographs from her apartment sat on the nightstand. I'll leave you to settle in, John said from the doorway. We'll have dinner later and go over media strategy. Try to rest. Tomorrow starts the real war. After he left, Catalina sat on the bed trying to process how quickly her life had transformed from solitary revenge to something far more complicated. She was living in the home of a man who admitted to stalking her, who fell in love through invasion of privacy, who wanted to use her as a weapon. Everything should have terrified her. Instead, she felt the strange calm that comes from finally having backup in a fight you'd been waging alone. Her phone buzzed with a text from Elise. Gave investigators everything. Richard's lawyer's already threatening me. I'm scared. Catalina stared at the message before typing back, Good. Fear is what you should have felt before you betrayed me. Use it to make better choices. She deleted Elise's response without reading it. Outside her window, the sun was setting in shades of blood and fire. Somewhere across the city, Richard sat in a cell, plotting his escape. Somewhere in expensive offices, powerful men made plans to crush her. And somewhere in this fortress disguised as a home, she was learning to trust again, despite every instinct screaming that trust was dangerous. Tomorrow they would release the first wave of stories. Tomorrow the real battle would begin, and there would be no mercy. But tonight, for the first time in a decade, Catalina Jason fell asleep feeling safe enough to dream about a future where she wasn't drowning. Chapter 5. The Courtroom Warfare. The courthouse steps felt like climbing toward execution. Media vans lined the street with cameras tracking her approach, and Catalina could feel public scrutiny pressing against her skin like unwanted contact. John walked beside her, his hand not touching hers, but close enough that she drew strength from his proximity. Behind them came the legal team, warriors dressed in suits who understood this battle would be won on technicalities rather than simple truth. Richard's lawyers had filed motion after motion attempting to suppress evidence, delay proceedings, and paint Catalina as unstable. The media campaign had been devastatingly effective, turning public opinion against her with manufactured stories about mental illness. Overnight, she had transformed from sympathetic victim to dangerous woman scorned. Inside the courtroom, air felt thick enough to choke on. Richard sat at the defense table looking nothing like the monster who tormented her. Instead, appearing as a confused husband being persecuted by a wife who couldn't accept their marriage had failed. His lawyers had dressed him in soft colors, suggesting vulnerability, and his posture radiated injured innocence that made Catalina want to scream. Judge Patricia Holloway entered and everyone rose. Catalina studied the woman who would decide her future. The judge had a reputation for fairness tempered with skepticism, her face carved with lines suggesting years of witnessing humanity's worst behaviors. Richard's lead attorney Gerard Hastings stood, his voice carrying smooth confidence. "Your Honor, we're here because my client's wife orchestrated an elaborate public humiliation based on evidence she claims to have collected legitimately. However, our investigation reveals obsessive behavior, illegal surveillance, and manufactured evidence. Miss Jason has documented mental health struggles, including depression, anxiety, and what professionals describe as delusional thinking related to fertility issues." Diana Rothschild shot to her feet. "Your Honor, this is character assassination. Ms. Jason's mental health struggles were direct result of abuse she endured, not evidence of unreliability." "I'll allow Mr. Hastings to continue," Judge Holloway said, expression revealing nothing. "But keep it relevant," Hastings smiled. "The relevance is that Ms. Jason's evidence collection violated multiple privacy laws. She installed recording devices without Mr. Walker's knowledge. She accessed private financial records illegally. She conspired with outside parties to conduct surveillance bordering on stalking. Every piece of evidence was obtained through criminal activity, rendering it inadmissible." Diana stood again, rage barely contained beneath professional composure. Ms. Jason had every right to document abuse in her own home. She had every right to investigate financial crimes being committed against her. Mr. Hastings wants this court to rule that victims cannot defend themselves or gather evidence of abuse. The law doesn't distinguish between evidence gathered by victims versus anyone else, Hastings countered. If these recording methods would be illegal for police without a warrant, they're illegal for private citizens, regardless of motivation. We're asking the court to suppress all evidence obtained through unlawful surveillance. The arguments continued for hours, legal precedents flying back and forth like weapons. Catalina felt her stomach turning as she realized how easily the system could be manipulated to protect abusers while punishing victims who dared fight back. She watched Richard whispering with his lawyers, saw him glancing at her with calculated pity meant for the judge's benefit. When the judge finally called a recess, Diana pulled Catalina and John into a private conference room. "They're going to win the suppression motion on at least some evidence. Recordings made without Richard's knowledge in your shared home might survive, but anything from his private office or through hacking will likely be thrown out." "What does that leave us?" Catalina asked, voice hollow. "Enough to prosecute, maybe not enough to convict. The medical evidence showing he sabotaged your fertility stands independent of surveillance. Elise's testimony about conspiracy and your parents' murder doesn't require disputed recordings. We have the mechanic's testimony, but without financial records showing full scope of fraud, we lose the most compelling evidence of systematic abuse." John slammed his fist on the table. This is exactly what they wanted. Used legal technicalities to exclude truth because discovery method wasn't pristine. Richard's crimes get minimized to a few incidents. "I'm aware of the injustice," Diana said through clenched teeth. "But I practice law in the real world, where rules matter even when they protect guilty people. We work with what we have or lose everything. Then we make what we have count," Catalina said, and both turned to look at her. "I testify. I take the stand and tell my story in my own words, and I make that jury see what Richard did." Diana shook her head immediately. That's exactly what Hastings wants. He'll destroy you on cross-examination, use every therapy note and medical record to paint you as unreliable. By the time he's finished, the jury will think you fabricated everything. So I'll be prepared. You coach me. We anticipate every attack. But I can't sit silently while Richard's lawyers rewrite history. She's right, John said quietly. The jury needs to hear directly from Catalina. They need to see her strength and understand she's not the unstable woman Hastings describes. It's a risk, but staying silent is bigger. Diana studied Catalina with assessment that felt like being X-rayed. If you testify, there's no protecting you from the worst parts. Every miscarriage, every panic attack, every private moment becomes public record. Richard's lawyers will try to break you on the stand, and cameras will capture every second. Are you absolutely certain you can handle that? I've already been broken by Richard. This time I'll be broken on my own terms, and I'll make sure everyone sees exactly what he did to create those fractures. The afternoon session brought devastating news as Judge Holloway ruled on evidence. As Diana predicted, most financial records obtained through illegal methods were suppressed, leaving gaping holes in their case. Richard's expression transformed from worried to triumphant as each ruling went in his favor. When court adjourned, Richard approached her in the hallway with his lawyers flanking him. The smirk on his face made her hands ball into fists. "Having regrets yet?" he asked, voice low enough that reporters couldn't hear. "You had a chance to take the money and disappear. Now you're going to lose everything in front of the entire world. I'd rather lose everything than let you walk away without consequences." "Consequences?" Richard laughed. "The only person facing consequences is you. My lawyers are going to rip you apart so thoroughly that your own family won't recognize what's left. And when this is over, I'll still be free because you were too emotional to understand how power works." John stepped between them before Catalina could respond, body language radiating threat. "If you come near her again, if you so much as look at her wrong, I will make you regret every breath you've taken." "Is this your new protector?" Richard asked, pretending to peer around John. "Trading one man for another? That's very on brand for you. Can't exist without a man defining your worth." "Walk away," John growled, and something in his tone made even Hastings grab Richard's arm and pull him backward. "This isn't over," Richard called as his team retreated. "Not even close." After he disappeared, Catalina felt her knees go weak, and John caught her. "Don't listen to him. He's desperate and trying to rattle you. He's winning. The judge suppressed half our evidence. The jury pool has been poisoned, and every day brings new motions designed to delay and confuse. How do we fight this? We fight by refusing to break, by showing up every day and telling the truth, even when it costs us, by being exactly what they don't expect." They drove back to John's estate in silence that felt heavy with unspoken fears. Inside, Diana was already waiting, and they spent the evening conducting mock cross-examinations, where Diana played Hastings with such vicious accuracy that Catalina found herself in tears multiple times before, learning to control emotional responses. Every vulnerable moment from her marriage became ammunition for practice attacks, and by midnight, Catalina felt hollowed out and raw. John found her later on the terrace, overlooking gardens turned silver by moonlight, and he sat beside her without speaking. When he finally broke the silence, his voice carried exhaustion. "I'm sorry I dragged you into this fight. I thought we could win quickly. I was wrong. You didn't drag me anywhere. I chose this knowing it would be brutal. But did you know it would be this brutal?" Catalina thought seriously. "I think part of me hoped that truth would be enough, that presenting evidence would automatically lead to justice. I was naive. I didn't understand the system is designed to protect men like Richard from women like me. It's not too late to walk away. Take the settlement, disappear, and live in peace. Would you really understand if I abandoned this fight?" John reached for her hand, and this time she let him take it. "I'd understand because I don't want to watch them destroy you. Isabel's death almost killed me, and I've spent years not letting myself care about people, because caring makes you vulnerable. But somehow you've gotten past every defense I built, and now I'm terrified they'll hurt you. I'm not Isabel. I won't break that easily. That's what terrifies me most. You're so determined you'll let them tear you apart piece by piece rather than surrender. And I'll have to watch, because stopping you would mean betraying everything we're fighting for. Catalina squeezed his hand. Then don't watch. Fight beside me. If I'm going down, I want company in the wreckage. That's the most romantic thing anyone's ever said to me. Despite everything, Catalina found herself laughing with genuine amusement. We're both deeply damaged, if that counts as romance. Damage recognizes damage. Maybe that's the only kind of connection that survives in a world this broken. They sat together until the moon set. When John finally walked her back to her room, he kissed her forehead with such gentleness that tears pricked her eyes. "Get some sleep," he whispered. "Tomorrow we start preparing you to testify." After her door closed, Catalina leaned against it and let herself admit what she'd been denying. She was falling for John Coupland, despite every instinct screaming that trust was dangerous. She was falling for someone who saw her as powerful instead of pathetic, who wanted her fury instead of her submission. She climbed into bed and dreamed of courtrooms where she stood tall while Richard crumbled. But when she woke, reality reasserted itself with Diana's voice, delivering news that made her stomach drop. Another victim had come forward, but this victim was claiming Catalina had known about Richard's abuse of other women and done nothing to stop it. Chapter 6. The Predator's New Weapon. Claire Montgomery's face appeared on every news channel like an accusation made flesh. She was beautiful in that fragile way that made men want to protect her, with tears streaming down her cheeks as she described Richard's seduction and subsequent destruction. But the part that made Catalina's blood run cold was when Claire claimed they had met at a charity event where Catalina was present, that Catalina had witnessed Richard's inappropriate behavior but turned away as if granting silent permission for what came next. "This is insane," Catalina said, staring at the television in John's office. "I don't even know this woman. I've never seen her before." John rewound the footage, freezing on a frame showing Claire holding a photograph. The image showed Richard with his arm around Claire's waist, both smiling, and in the background stood a woman whose profile resembled Catalina's enough to be convincing if you didn't look too closely. "She's using this photo as proof you were there. But that's not you. Obviously it's not me, but how do we prove that when Richard attended dozens of events without me? His lawyers will claim I was there briefly." Diana entered looking like she'd aged a decade overnight, carrying files that landed on John's desk with force suggesting barely controlled rage. "Claire Montgomery is a plant. She's being paid by Richard's legal team to destroy your credibility. Social media is already turning against you, claiming you enabled Richard's abuse because you were comfortable being married to wealth. Can we prove she's lying?" "Proving a negative is almost impossible. We can show you weren't at that event by providing credit card statements and phone records showing you were somewhere else. But they'll argue you could have attended briefly and left. They've built plausible deniability into every claim." John pulled up enhanced versions of the photograph, zooming in until pixels became visible. "This is definitely not Catalina. Look at the nose structure, the jawline. Someone found a woman who resembles her from behind and staged this photo specifically. But the damage is done," Catalina said, sinking into a chair. "Even if we prove this specific claim is false, the doubt has been planted. People will wonder what else I knew about Richard's activities. Whether I turned a blind eye to save my marriage." Her phone began buzzing with notifications. Hundreds of messages from people she barely knew, expressing disgust at her supposed complicity. Former friends who abandoned her after the anniversary party now sent messages dripping with vindication, as if Claire's accusations confirmed what they had suspected all along. Even her extended family started posting carefully worded statements on social media, suggesting they had always questioned Catalina's version of events. "We need to go on the offensive," John said, his jaw tight with barely contained rage. "Release everything we have about Richard's network. Expose every crime, every victim. Overwhelm their manufactured scandal with actual truth." "That's premature," Diana argued. "We don't have enough verified evidence yet. If we release partial information, they'll discredit all of it by pointing out gaps. We need airtight documentation before we go public with accusations against powerful men." "Then we don't have time to be careful. Every day we wait is another day they control the narrative and turn public opinion further against Catalina." They argued for hours, while Catalina sat silently processing the reality that she was losing a war she hadn't fully understood she was fighting. Richard wasn't just defending himself, he was systematically destroying her until nothing remained but a cautionary tale about vindictive wives who fabricated abuse claims. The anniversary party that had felt like victory now seemed like the beginning of her complete annihilation. That night, someone threw a brick through the window of John's estate, and attached to it was a note written in block letters, "Abusers protect abusers." "You're next." Security cameras caught footage of a figure in dark clothing disappearing into the woods, but they moved with professional efficiency, suggesting training rather than simple vandalism. John's security team increased patrols and installed additional measures. But the message was clear. They weren't safe even behind walls and gates. Catalina found herself unable to sleep, wandering the halls like a ghost, haunting someone else's life. She ended up in John's office, surrounded by files documenting crimes she was supposedly fighting against, and felt the weight of futility pressing down until she could barely breathe. Her hands shook as she picked up photographs of other women Richard had destroyed, women whose stories were eerily similar to her own. "You're spiraling," John said from the doorway. He wore sleeping clothes, but his eyes were alert with chronic insomnia. "I recognize the signs because I've been there myself. How did you survive it? How did you keep fighting when everything felt hopeless?" John crossed the office and pulled her against his chest with gentle firmness, and she let herself lean into his warmth, because pretending she didn't need comfort was exhausting. "I survived by being angry instead of defeated. Every setback made me more determined to destroy the people who destroyed Isabel. Rage kept me functional when grief would have drowned me. I'm so tired of being angry. It's consuming everything until there's nothing left but fury and pain. Then let it consume you temporarily. Channel it into fuel for what comes next. You don't have to be noble or graceful or anything except ruthlessly determined to win." Catalina pulled back enough to look at his face, searching for the lie she expected, but seeing only naked honesty. "What if we're wrong? What if we're the villains in this story and we're too damaged to see it? Then we're villains who tell the truth, which is more than Richard and his network can claim. I'd rather be an honest monster than a liar wearing a mask of virtue." That's a terrifying philosophy. It's the only philosophy that lets me sleep at night. They stood together in the darkness, and Catalina felt something fundamental shift in their relationship. Some boundary dissolving that had kept them in safe territory of alliance instead of dangerous ground of actual intimacy. She reached up to touch his face, her fingers tracing lines carved by years of suppressed grief, and when he leaned into her palm, like a man starving for gentle contact, she understood they were both too broken for conventional relationships, but might somehow fit together in their mutual destruction. For a moment, she thought about kissing him, wondered what it would feel like to let someone touch her with tenderness instead of possession. But the thought terrified her, and she pulled her hand back, wrapping her arms around herself protectively. "I'm sorry," she whispered. I can't, not yet. I don't know if I'll ever be able to. John didn't look disappointed or frustrated. He just nodded with understanding that came from his own trauma. You don't have to apologize. Healing doesn't have a timeline, and intimacy isn't something you owe anyone, especially not after what you've survived. You're not angry? Why would I be angry? You're not a prize to be won or a goal to be achieved. You're a person with wounds that need time to heal, and I'm willing to wait as long as it takes, even if that means forever. The simple acceptance of that statement made tears prick her eyes. Richard would have been furious at being denied what he considered his right. Richard would have pushed and manipulated and made her feel guilty for having boundaries. The fact that John simply accepted her no without making her feel broken was more intimate than any kiss could have been. "Thank you," she said, and meant it more deeply than he could possibly know. "Come on," John said, offering his hand without any expectation beyond the comfort of human contact. "Let's go inside. You need sleep, and tomorrow's going to be brutal." She took his hand, letting herself have that much connection without forcing anything more. They walked back to her room together, and when he left her at the door with nothing more than a gentle squeeze of her fingers, Catalina felt something that might have been hope beginning to bloom in the ruins of her heart. "We need to prepare for Claire's testimony," John said eventually, voice rough with exhaustion. "Diana scheduled a meeting this morning to develop our counter-strategy. I don't know how to fight someone claiming I enabled abuse when I barely survived my own. By showing them exactly who you are. Someone strong enough to destroy her abuser and compassionate enough to help his other victims. We'll find other women Richard hurt and give them a platform. We'll show that you're not protecting him, you're leading the charge against him. What if they're all afraid? What if no one else is willing to come forward and risk what I'm risking? Then we make it safe enough that they can. We expose Richard's network so thoroughly that his ability to retaliate is destroyed." They separated reluctantly to face the day ahead. Catalina showered away evidence of their night together, while trying to process what it meant that she had sought comfort in John's arms. She wasn't ready for a relationship, wasn't prepared to trust anyone with the kind of vulnerability that intimacy required. But somehow, John had slipped past her defenses by offering her partnership instead of protection. Diana arrived looking like she'd spent the night chasing down leads. When they gathered in the conference room, she laid out evidence that made Catalina's breath catch with hope. Claire Montgomery isn't who she claims to be. Her real name is Claire Dawson, and she's an actress who's appeared in several low-budget productions. More importantly, she received a wire transfer of $200,000 from an account linked to Lawrence Thorne's law firm 3 days before her first interview aired. "Can we prove the connection to Richard? We can prove she was paid by his legal team, which is enough to destroy her credibility. But there's more. I found 2 other women who came forward in previous cases against men in Richard's network, both claiming to be victims, but later revealed to be paid plants designed to discredit actual victims. It's a pattern, and we can document it." John leaned forward with predatory interest. "So we don't just discredit Claire. We expose the entire strategy of using fake victims to undermine real accusations. That turns their weapon against them." "Exactly. We hold a press conference, present the evidence, and force them to defend their tactics instead of attacking Catalina." They spent the morning preparing, and by afternoon, Catalina stood before cameras again with John beside her as moral support. The questions came fast and brutal, reporters shouting over each other. "Ms. Jason, how do you respond to accusations that you enabled your husband's abuse of other women?" Diana stepped forward before Catalina could answer. "We respond by presenting evidence that Claire Montgomery is a paid actress hired to discredit my client. Here are bank records showing a payment from Richard Walker's legal team to Ms. Montgomery days before her allegations became public. Here is documentation of her acting career. And here is proof that this same tactic has been used in at least 2 other cases involving men in Mr. Walker's network. The real question is why powerful men need to hire fake victims. The press conference erupted into chaos. But even as they scored this victory, Catalina could see Richard's lawyers in the back making phone calls. They would regroup, develop new strategies, find different ways to attack her credibility. That night, as she lay in bed replaying the day's events, her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. The message was simple but chilling. "You embarrassed powerful men today. They don't forgive that. Watch your back." She showed it to John, who immediately contacted his security team and ordered additional protection. But they both knew that all the security in the world couldn't protect against people with unlimited resources and no moral boundaries. "I won't let them hurt you," John said, his arms tight around her as if he could physically shield her from threats he couldn't see coming. "You might not have a choice. They've already killed your wife and my parents. What makes us think we're any different? Because this time they're dealing with two people who have nothing left to lose and everything to fight for. That makes us more dangerous than they realize." Catalina closed her eyes and tried to believe him. But in the darkness behind her eyelids, all she could see were the faces of women Richard had destroyed. Women whose stories ended in silence and graves instead of justice. She had declared war on monsters, and monsters rarely went down without taking their enemies with them. Chapter 7. The Dying Man's Confession. The breakthrough came from a source nobody expected. A dying man, with nothing left to lose and everything to confess. Thomas Garrett had been Richard's business manager for 15 years. Handling transactions that never appeared in official records and managing relationships with people whose names couldn't be spoken in polite company. Now he was in hospice care with cancer eating through his organs, and according to John's investigators, he wanted to talk before death silenced him permanently. Catalina and John drove to the hospice facility through rain that turned the world grey and blurred. This man had been complicit in Richard's crimes for over a decade, had helped orchestrate frauds and cover up abuses, and now he wanted absolution or revenge or whatever passed for peace when you were dying with blood on your hands. She didn't know if she had enough humanity left to offer forgiveness, but she was willing to hear what he had to say if it helped destroy Richard more completely. Thomas Garrett looked like a skeleton wrapped in parchment skin, his body consuming itself from the inside while machines monitored the slow collapse of his systems. But his eyes were sharp when they focused on Catalina. "You look like your mother," he said, voice barely above a whisper. "She was a good woman. Richard killed her because she saw through him. I know he killed my parents. I have the mechanic's testimony about the brake lines. That's only part of the story. Your mother hired investigators before she died. She discovered Richard had been married before, that his first wife disappeared under suspicious circumstances that were never properly investigated. She was going to force him to confess or she would expose him, and that's when he decided she had to die." John pulled out a recording device with Thomas's permission, and the dying man's confession spilled out like poison, draining from an infected wound. He described Richard's first marriage to a young woman named Bethany, who came from old money and fewer connections. Richard had seduced her, married her, and within 2 years she vanished during a boating trip that Richard claimed he wasn't present for. Her body was never found. The investigation concluded she had fallen overboard accidentally, and Richard inherited everything after the waiting period for declaring her legally dead. "He told me once that killing her was easier than divorce," Thomas rasped, breathing labored. "Said drowning someone in the ocean was perfect because bodies that aren't found can't be autopsied." He was proud of himself, like he'd discovered some clever trick nobody else had thought of. Catalina felt bile rising in her throat. "Why didn't you go to the police?" "Because I was complicit. I helped him establish alibis, paid off witnesses who might have contradicted his story, made sure the investigation stayed superficial. By the time I understood what he really was, I was in too deep to confess without destroying myself. So I stayed silent and helped him destroy more lives, and now I'm dying, knowing I enabled a monster because I was too much of a coward to do what was right. Is there evidence? Anything that proves what you're saying? Thomas gestured weakly toward a lockbox on the bedside table. Everything I saved over the years. Documents Richard thought were destroyed. Recordings of conversations where he admitted things he shouldn't have. Photographs of him with women who later disappeared or died under suspicious circumstances. I kept it all as insurance, thinking maybe someday I'd need leverage against him. But insurance only matters if you live long enough to use it, and I won't. John opened the lockbox with trembling hands, and inside was a treasure trove of evidence that would destroy Richard so completely there would be nothing left but rubble and regrets. Bank transfers showing payoffs to corrupt officials. Photographs of Richard with women whose missing person reports matched the dates of the images. Audio recordings where Richard bragged about crimes while drunk at parties, never imagining his trusted manager was documenting everything. "Why are you giving this to us now?" Catalina asked, voice thick with emotions she couldn't fully name. "Because I'm dying, and I want one thing about my life to have meant something good. I want Richard to pay for what he did, and I want the women he destroyed to have their stories told. I can't undo my complicity, but I can make sure the truth survives me." They spent hours going through the contents while Thomas drifted in and out of consciousness. And with each new piece of evidence, Catalina felt the case against Richard transforming from a single woman's accusation into documentation of systematic predation spanning 2 decades. There were at least 4 other women besides Bethany and Isabel who had died or disappeared after becoming involved with Richard, each death ruled accidental or suicide despite suspicious circumstances that were never properly investigated. "He's not just a wife abuser," John said, voice hollow with horror. "He's a serial killer who found the perfect victims, women with money and limited family connections who could disappear without raising too many questions." Isabel fit that profile perfectly. So did Catalina. Thomas opened his eyes at that, focusing on Catalina with what might have been regret. "He was planning to kill you too. I saw the life insurance policies he took out, saw him researching accidents that looked natural. When I confronted him, he just smiled and said marriage was profitable if you knew how to manage it properly. That's when I started keeping this evidence. I thought if I documented everything, I could stop him before he murdered again. But you didn't stop him. You just watched and collected proof while he destroyed more lives. I know. I'm a coward who valued self-preservation over human decency. But maybe this evidence can prevent him from killing anyone else. Maybe that counts for something." Thomas died 3 hours later with John and Catalina still in his room, reviewing evidence that would finally bring Richard to complete justice. The hospice staff came to disconnect machines and prepare the body for removal, and Catalina felt strange, sitting in a room with a corpse that represented both her salvation and a cautionary tale about the cost of moral cowardice. They left the hospice with the lockbox secured in John's car, and Diana met them at the estate to review everything Thomas had provided. When she finished reading through documents and listening to recordings, her expression was grim triumph mixed with horror. "This changes everything. We're not just prosecuting domestic abuse and fraud anymore. We're building a case for multiple murders, conspiracy, and serial predation. Richard will die in prison if he's not executed." "Elise has been charged as an accessory to murder," Diana informed them during one of their meetings. "She's cooperating fully, which will reduce her sentence, but she's still looking at 5 to 8 years in prison. The judge made it clear that ignorance isn't a defense when you help someone commit murder, even if you claim you didn't know what was happening." Catalina felt complicated emotions about that. Part of her was satisfied that Elise would face real consequences. Part of her grieved for the sister she'd lost and the niece or nephew who would grow up with a mother in prison. What about the baby? Elise will have the baby before sentencing. Your family has agreed to take custody during her incarceration. She'll be able to maintain parental rights if she completes the rehabilitation programs the court mandates. It wasn't perfect justice, but it was something. Elise would pay for her role in their parents' deaths, even if that payment would never fully balance the scales. The accumulated evidence painted a devastating picture. John's investigators compiled everything into a comprehensive timeline showing Richard's pattern of predation spanning 2 decades. Diana worked with prosecutors to build charges that covered not just Catalina's abuse but multiple murders, conspiracy and fraud on a massive scale. "We have enough," Diana announced at a meeting 3 weeks after they'd started assembling the expanded case. "We can prove Richard is a serial killer who's been murdering wealthy women for their money. We can prove he killed your parents. We can prove the systematic abuse against you. His lawyers are going to fight every piece of evidence, but the pattern is undeniable." The hardest part was identifying all of Richard's victims and contacting their families. John's team found 7 women total whose deaths or disappearances could be credibly linked to Richard. Each family had to be approached carefully, told that their loved one's death might not have been an accident, offered the chance to see justice finally served. Some families welcomed the reopened investigations. Others were angry, insisting their loved ones had died naturally and accusing Catalina of manufacturing a conspiracy. One woman's brother thanked them with tears streaming down his face, saying he'd always known Richard had killed his sister, but couldn't prove it. Another family hired lawyers to fight the exhumation order Diana had requested. "This is why he got away with it for so long," John said one night as they reviewed responses from victims' families. "He chose women whose families were too small or too fragmented to mount effective investigations. He knew that grief makes people want closure, and calling deaths accidents gives closure even when it's a lie." Catalina looked at photographs of the 7 women, studying their faces and wondering what their lives had been like before Richard destroyed them. They deserved better than what he gave them. They deserved to be believed when they were alive, to have people who would fight for them, to be more than just convenient victims. You're giving them that now. You're making sure their deaths matter, that their stories are told, that Richard pays for every single life he took. That's not nothing. Thomas Garrett died before he could testify in court. His recorded deposition played for the jury instead. But his testimony was just one piece of a much larger puzzle. The real work had been done by investigators who refused to accept convenient explanations, by forensic accountants who tracked money through shell companies, by women brave enough to come forward and testify about escaping Richard before he could kill them too. At dawn, Diana filed emergency motions to amend the charges, and by noon the courtroom was packed with journalists and spectators who sensed this case was transforming into something historic. Judge Holloway reviewed the new evidence with an expression that grew progressively more disturbed. The evidence came from dozens of sources: financial records, witness testimonies, forensic analysis, phone records, security footage, and testimonies from both willing and reluctant witnesses who had watched Richard's pattern of destruction for years. When she finally looked up at Richard sitting at the defense table, her gaze carried condemnation that no amount of expensive legal defense could soften. "Mr. Walker, based on evidence presented this morning, I'm adding charges of conspiracy to commit murder in the deaths of Bethany Walker, Isabel Coupland, and Michael and Eleanor Jason. I'm also ordering you held without bail, pending psychiatric evaluation." Richard's composure cracked for the first time since his arrest, his face going pale as he realized the full extent of what was being alleged. His lawyers immediately objected, arguing that adding murder charges based on old cases was prejudicial and designed to inflame the jury. but Judge Holloway cut them off with a glare that could freeze blood. The evidence presented shows a pattern of behavior that goes directly to Mr. Walker's character and intent. I'm allowing the expanded charges, and I'm revoking bail because the defendant has now been credibly accused of multiple murders. He represents a flight risk and a danger to potential witnesses. Your Honor, this is outrageous, Gerard Hastings sputtered, his usual smooth confidence shattered. My client is being tried by media speculation and the deathbed ramblings of a man with nothing to lose. This evidence should be excluded as unreliable. Your client is being tried by documented proof that he's killed multiple women and gotten away with it. If you want to challenge the evidence, do it at trial. But Mr. Walker is remaining in custody until this matter is resolved. They dragged Richard away in handcuffs while he screamed accusations at Catalina, calling her a liar and a manipulator and swearing he would destroy her even from prison. The threats echoed through the courtroom even after the doors closed behind him, and Catalina felt John's hand find hers under the table, squeezing with enough pressure to anchor her to reality. Outside the courthouse, media swarmed them with questions about the new charges, and Diana handled the press conference with practiced efficiency. My client feels vindicated that the truth is finally being acknowledged, and devastated that so many women died before anyone took accusations seriously. This case demonstrates why we must believe women when they report abuse, because sometimes that abuse is hiding something even darker. They fought through the crowd to reach John's car, and once inside with doors locked and privacy-tinted windows hiding them from public view, Catalina finally let herself break. The sobs came from somewhere deep in her chest, tearing through her throat like they were ripping pieces of her soul out, and John just held her while she grieved for all the women Richard had killed and all the years she had spent sleeping beside a monster without fully understanding what he was capable of. I could have been one of them, she gasped between sobs. He had life insurance policies on me. He was planning to make me disappear just like Bethany and the others. I was going to be another convenient accident. But you're not. You survived him and exposed him and made sure he'll never hurt anyone else. That counts for everything. Does it? Does it really count when so many women died because nobody was brave enough to stop him sooner? John pulled back enough to look at her face, and his expression carried fierce certainty. Yes, it counts. You're the reason his killing spree ends. You're the reason all those other victims finally get justice. You're the reason women in the future won't fall into his trap. That's not nothing, Catalina. That's everything. They drove back to the estate in silence that felt both heavy and light, weighted with horror, but lifted by knowledge that Richard's ability to destroy had finally been neutralized. Inside, John poured them both whiskey that burned going down, and they sat together on the terrace, watching the sun set in colors that looked too beautiful for a day that had been so dark. Somewhere across the city, Richard sat in a jail cell, understanding that his life as he knew it was finished, that he would never breathe free air again, that the legacy he would leave behind was monster instead of respected man. And somewhere in the recesses of Catalina's damaged heart, she felt the first stirrings of something that might eventually become peace. Chapter 8. The Final Assault. The next morning brought news that made Catalina's blood run cold. Someone had leaked Thomas Garrett's evidence to the media before Diana could control the narrative. And now every news outlet was running stories about Richard Walker, the serial killer. But worse than the media frenzy was the backlash. Richard's remaining allies were mounting a desperate counterattack, and they were willing to destroy anyone in their path. They filed a motion claiming Thomas Garrett's evidence was fabricated, Diana said, bursting into the estate's dining room where Catalina and John were having breakfast. They're arguing that Thomas had a grudge against Richard and manufactured everything on his deathbed to get revenge. They've got 3 forensic experts prepared to testify that the audio recordings were doctored and the documents contain anachronisms that prove they couldn't be authentic. That's insane, John said. We can prove the authenticity of everything in that lockbox. They don't need to prove the evidence is fake. They just need to create enough doubt that the jury questions its reliability. It's the same strategy they've been using all along, muddy the waters until nobody knows what to believe. Catalina set down her coffee cup with deliberate control, refusing to let the panic building in her chest show on her face. Then we need to find other evidence that corroborates Thomas's claims. If we can independently verify even a few of the things he documented, it becomes much harder to argue he fabricated everything. That's exactly what I'm thinking, Diana said. John, can your investigators track down the women Thomas identified in those photographs? If even one of them is still alive and willing to testify about Richard, it destroys the fabrication argument. I'll have my team on it immediately, John replied, already pulling out his phone. But as they mobilized to counter Richard's latest assault, Catalina felt something shift in her understanding of the battle they were fighting. This wasn't just about putting Richard in prison anymore. This was about dismantling an entire system that protected men like him, that enabled their crimes, that prioritized their comfort over the lives of the women they destroyed. Thomas Garrett's evidence had revealed that Richard was part of something much larger, a network of powerful men who helped each other escape consequences while their victims suffered in silence. We need to go after all of them, Catalina said suddenly, interrupting Diana and John's strategic planning. Not just Richard. Everyone in his network, everyone who helped him, who covered for him, who profited from his crimes. We need to burn the entire thing down. Diana and John exchanged glances. That's a much bigger fight than we initially planned for, Diana said carefully. Going after Richard is one thing. Going after dozens of powerful men with unlimited resources is something else entirely. I don't care. They're all guilty. They all enabled this. If we just punish Richard and leave the system intact, another man exactly like him will take his place and the cycle continues. John moved to stand beside her, his hand finding hers beneath the table. She's right. We've been thinking too small. Thomas's evidence doesn't just prove Richard is a serial killer. It exposes a network that has been protecting serial killers and abusers for decades. If we don't take this opportunity to destroy all of them, we're wasting everything Thomas died to give us. Diana studied them both for a long moment before nodding slowly. All right. But understand what you're committing to. These men will fight back with everything they have. They'll use every dirty trick, every legal loophole, every corrupt official in their pocket. They'll try to destroy you financially, socially, legally, and if that doesn't work, they'll try to destroy you physically. Are you absolutely certain you're ready for that level of warfare? Yes, Catalina said without hesitation, and felt John squeeze her hand in solidarity. Over the next week, they built their case against not just Richard, but his entire network. John's investigators worked around the clock, tracking down women who had survived encounters with Richard's associates, documenting patterns of abuse and predation that mirrored Richard's own crimes. Diana coordinated with prosecutors in multiple jurisdictions, sharing evidence and building coalitions of law enforcement willing to take on powerful men they had previously considered untouchable. But the network fought back with vicious efficiency. Catalina's bank accounts were suddenly frozen by court order based on spurious claims that she had committed fraud. Her penthouse was raided by police claiming an anonymous tip about drug possession, and though they found nothing, the media coverage made her look like a criminal. Her remaining friends received threatening letters suggesting that anyone associated with her would face professional and personal consequences. The worst attack came on a Thursday evening when Catalina was alone in the estate's library, John having left for a meeting with investigators. She heard glass breaking somewhere in the house, followed by shouting and the sound of John's security team responding to an intrusion. Before she could reach the phone to call for help, 3 men in masks burst into the library. They didn't say anything, didn't make demands or threats. They simply advanced on her with cold efficiency that suggested professional training. Catalina grabbed the nearest heavy object, a bronze statue from the desk, and swung it at the first man's head with all her strength. The impact sent him staggering backward, blood streaming from a gash above his eye. But the other 2 kept coming. She fought with desperate fury, using everything John's security team had taught her about self-defense. But 3 trained attackers against 1 woman was mathematics that didn't favor survival. One of them got behind her and wrapped his arm around her throat in a chokehold, and as her vision started to tunnel from lack of oxygen, Catalina understood with terrible clarity that they weren't here to threaten her. They were here to kill her. The sound of gunfire exploded through the library, and suddenly the man holding her collapsed, his grip loosening enough that she could tear free. John stood in the doorway with a gun in his hands. His face transformed into something terrifying as he fired again, dropping another attacker. The 3rd man tried to flee, but John's security team tackled him before he could reach the window. In the aftermath, with police swarming the estate and paramedics checking her for injuries, Catalina sat on the library floor and shook with adrenaline crash and delayed terror. John knelt beside her, his hands gentle as they checked her for wounds, even though his eyes still carried the cold fury of someone who had just killed to protect what he loved. "I'm sorry," he said, voice rough with emotion. "I should have been here. I should have protected you better." "You saved my life," Catalina replied, and her voice sounded strange even to her own ears, distant and shocky. "If you hadn't come back when you did, don't think about that. Don't think about what could have happened. Focus on the fact that you survived and they didn't." But she couldn't stop thinking about it. Couldn't stop feeling the arm around her throat cutting off her air. Couldn't stop seeing the cold efficiency in those men's eyes as they advanced on her. She had come so close to being another one of Richard's victims. Another woman who died because she dared to fight back. The police questioned them for hours, taking statements and photographing the scene. The attackers had no identification on them, nothing that would tie them back to whoever had hired them, but everyone knew who was responsible. The surviving attacker was in custody, and Diana arrived with news that he was already talking, giving up names in exchange for a plea deal. After the police finally left and dawn was breaking over the estate, Catalina found she couldn't stop shaking. The adrenaline had worn off, leaving her hollow and terrified, in a way she hadn't been even during the worst of Richard's abuse. Because Richard's abuse had been psychological, calculated to destroy her slowly. This had been an attempt to end her life quickly and violently, and understanding how close she'd come to dying made her feel fragile in ways she'd been fighting against for months. John found her standing at the window of her bedroom, staring out at gardens that looked too peaceful for a place where people had just been killed. He didn't say anything, just wrapped his arms around her from behind and held her while she trembled. "I can't stop thinking about how it felt when I couldn't breathe," she whispered. "How I understood in that moment that I was going to die, that Richard would win after all, because he'd have me killed before I could destroy him completely. But you didn't die. You fought back and you survived. And now we have evidence that will bring down everyone who tried to hurt you. What if next time I'm not lucky enough to survive? What if they send more people, better people, and you're not here to save me?" John turned her around to face him, his hands gentle on her shoulders. "Then I'll make sure I'm always here. I'll make sure you're never alone or vulnerable again. I'll dedicate every resource I have to keeping you safe. You can't promise that. Nobody can promise that. Maybe not. But I can promise that I'll die trying to protect you, because losing you would destroy me in ways that losing Isabel didn't. because you're not just someone I'm working with or someone I admire. You're the person I'm in love with, and I can't lose you too." The confession hung between them, raw and honest and terrifying in its vulnerability. Catalina looked at his face and saw someone who meant every word, someone who had let her past his defenses despite knowing how dangerous that was. "I'm so broken," she whispered. "Richard broke me in ways I don't know if I can recover from. I don't know if I'm capable of loving someone back the way they deserve. I don't need you to be unbroken. I need you to be exactly who you are, damaged and fierce and surviving despite everything trying to kill you. And if you never love me back, that's okay. I'll still protect you, still fight beside you, still be here for whatever you need." But the truth was, Catalina realized she already did love him. She had been falling in love with him through every battle they fought together. Every moment he treated her as an equal instead of a victim. Every time he offered her strength instead of pity. The question wasn't whether she loved him, but whether she was brave enough to let herself have something good after so much horror. She reached up and touched his face, letting herself really look at him, really see the man who had saved her life, and asked for nothing in return. "I'm going to kiss you," she said, voice steadier than she expected. "And I need you to know that I mean it, that it's not just adrenaline or gratitude or trauma bonding. I'm choosing this. I'm choosing you." "Are you sure?" John asked, even as his hands tightened on her shoulders with barely restrained need. "Because once we cross this line, I won't be able to go back to pretending I'm not completely gone for you." "I'm sure," Catalina said, and kissed him. It was nothing like the kiss she'd imagined in the office weeks ago. This was born from survival and choice, and the terrifying realization that life was too short to deny yourself connection with people who saw your damage and loved you anyway. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Catalina felt tears on her cheeks that had nothing to do with sadness and everything to do with overwhelming relief of being touched with actual desire instead of possessive entitlement. "I love you," she said, and meant it despite the fear that came with such an admission. "I don't know if I'm good at it yet, if I remember how to love someone without expecting them to hurt me. But I want to try. With you. That's all I need," John replied, and kissed her again with tenderness that made her believe healing might actually be possible. They didn't have sex that night, both too exhausted and traumatized for anything beyond holding each other. But they fell asleep tangled together in Catalina's bed, and for the first time since her wedding night, she woke up beside a man feeling safe instead of trapped. Over the next few days, the arrests began. Lawrence Thorne was taken into custody on his way to court, led away in handcuffs while cameras captured his humiliation. Two of Richard's closest associates were arrested at their homes, their shocked wives and children watching as police led them away. The media, which had been so quick to turn on Catalina, now scrambled to rewrite the narrative, presenting her as a heroic survivor who had exposed a criminal conspiracy. But Catalina took no joy in the vindication. She was too tired, too damaged by the constant warfare, too haunted by how close she had come to dying on the library floor. She moved through the days in a fog of exhaustion and survivor's guilt, wondering if the women Richard had killed were watching somehow, if they felt vindicated or just sad that their deaths had been necessary to finally bring him to justice. John stayed close to her, offering quiet support without demanding she process her trauma on anyone's timeline but her own. He understood what it was like to survive an attempt on your life, what it did to your sense of safety and your ability to trust that the world wouldn't randomly try to kill you. They sat together in silence more often than they talked, and somehow the silence said more than words could have. The trial date was set for 3 months away, and Diana promised them that by the time they walked into that courtroom, they would have built a case so overwhelming that not even the best defense attorneys in the world could save Richard and his associates. Catalina wanted to believe her, wanted to feel confident that justice would finally prevail. But she had learned too much about how the system protected powerful men to trust that any outcome was guaranteed. "What if we go through all of this, and they still find a way to walk free?" she asked John one night, as they sat on the terrace watching stars appear in the darkening sky. "What if we sacrifice everything and it still isn't enough?" "Then we keep fighting," John replied simply. "We appeal, we retry, we find new evidence. We never stop until they're all in prison or dead. Because the alternative is letting them win, and I'm not prepared to do that." "Are you?" Catalina thought about Bethany drowning alone in the ocean. She thought about Isabel dying in a hotel room with Richard watching. She thought about her parents' car plunging off the road. She thought about all the women whose names she didn't know, whose stories had been lost to time and Richard's careful planning. "No," she said finally. "I'm not prepared to let them win, no matter how long it takes or how much it costs. I'm going to see this through to the end. Then we'll see it through together," John said, and kissed her with tenderness that felt like a promise of something beyond revenge and justice, something that might eventually resemble a future worth living. Chapter 9. The Reckoning Unleashed. The courtroom was packed beyond capacity on the first day of Richard's trial, with overflow crowds watching on screens in adjacent rooms and media stationed outside, broadcasting every development to a nation that had become obsessed with the case. Catalina walked through the gauntlet of cameras and spectators with her head held high, John beside her and Diana leading the way like a general marching into battle. Richard sat at the defense table looking diminished somehow, as if the weight of evidence against him had physically compressed him into something smaller than the man who had tormented her for a decade. His expensive lawyers flanked him, but their usual confidence had been replaced with grim determination of people who knew they were fighting a losing battle, but were being paid too much to surrender. Judge Holloway entered, and the courtroom rose as one. The judge had aged visibly since taking this case, the stress of presiding over what would likely be the most important trial of her career etched into new lines around her eyes. But her voice was steady as she called the proceedings to order and invited the prosecution to make their opening statement. Diana stood, and Catalina watched her transform into something magnificent and terrifying. "Your Honor, members of the jury, what you are about to hear over the next weeks is not the story of a single crime, or even a handful of crimes. What you are about to hear is the systematic destruction of human lives, by a man who has spent his entire adult life perfecting the art of killing women and making it look like anything but murder." She walked them through 2 decades of Richard's predation, starting with Bethany's disappearance and moving through each subsequent victim with methodical precision. She presented Thomas Garrett's evidence, authenticated by multiple forensic experts who confirmed its legitimacy. She called witnesses who testified to Richard's character, his manipulation, his cold calculation in choosing victims who would be easy to isolate and destroy. When Diana finally sat down after nearly 3 hours of opening statements, the jury looked shell-shocked, and several spectators were crying. Richard's lawyer, Gerard Hastings, stood to present the defense's opening, but his arguments felt hollow against the mountain of evidence Diana had outlined. He tried to paint Richard as a man being persecuted by a vindictive ex-wife and a conspiracy of people with grudges. But even he seemed to know nobody in that courtroom was buying it. The prosecution's case unfolded over 2 weeks, each day bringing new revelations that made Richard look worse. Diana called the mechanic who testified about cutting brake lines on Catalina's parents' car under Richard's orders. She called the detective who had been paid to cover up Isabel's death, who broke down on the stand, confessing his complicity. She called 3 women who had survived encounters with Richard's associates, their testimonies painting a picture of a network that had been preying on vulnerable women for decades. She presented the painstakingly assembled evidence from dozens of sources. Financial forensics showing the pattern of suspicious inheritances, phone records proving Richard had lied about his whereabouts during crucial time periods, testimony from private investigators who had worked for Richard, and security footage from hotels where Richard had been with victims shortly before they died. Thomas Garrett's testimony, recorded before his death, was just one piece of a massive puzzle that dozens of people had helped assemble. And then Diana called Catalina to the stand. Walking to the witness box felt like walking to her own execution, every eye in the courtroom tracking her movement. She placed her hand on the Bible and swore to tell the truth, and when she finally sat down and looked out at the sea of faces watching her, Catalina felt a strange calm settle over her. This was it. This was the moment where she either broke under the pressure or emerged victorious. There was no middle ground. Diana led her through her testimony with gentle precision, asking questions that allowed Catalina to tell her story in her own words. She described meeting Richard, the whirlwind courtship, the wedding that should have been the happiest day of her life. She described the slow erosion of her self-worth, the gaslighting, the isolation from friends and family. She described discovering she was pregnant and the joy that had filled her, followed by the agony of the first miscarriage. "Did you believe the miscarriage was natural?" Diana asked. "I did at the time," Catalina replied, her voice steady despite the tears threatening to fall. "Richard told me it was common, that my body just wasn't ready. He was so supportive, so loving in that moment. It never occurred to me that he had caused it deliberately. And when you had the second miscarriage, I blame myself. Richard suggested maybe I was too stressed, that I needed to relax more, take better care of myself. He made me believe that my body was failing because I wasn't trying hard enough to be healthy." Diana walked her through all 3 miscarriages, through the fertility treatments that destroyed her health, through the moment she discovered Richard's sterility and understood that he had been lying to her for years. She described finding evidence of his affairs, of his financial crimes, of his planning with Elise to have her institutionalized so he could take full control of her inheritance. "When did you learn that Richard had murdered your parents?" Diana asked. "When John Copeland showed me the evidence his investigators had uncovered. When I saw the mechanic's testimony about cutting the brake lines, when I read Richard's own notes about planning their deaths, that was the moment I understood I hadn't just married an abuser. I had married my parents' murderer." The courtroom was completely silent, every person holding their breath as Catalina described the horror of that realization. Even the judge was crying, though she tried to hide it behind her hand. Diana let the moment sit before asking her final question. "Miss Jason, after everything you've been through, after all the abuse and manipulation and horror, why didn't you just walk away? Why did you choose to fight?" Catalina looked directly at Richard, holding his gaze until he looked away. "Because walking away would have meant letting him win. It would have meant that Bethany died for nothing, that Isabel died for nothing, that my parents died for nothing. I fought because someone had to stand up and say that women's lives matter, that we're not disposable, that men like Richard don't get to keep destroying us without consequences. I fought because I wanted other women to know that they can survive monsters and come out the other side stronger. I fought because the alternative was letting him kill me too, and I wasn't ready to die." When Diana finished and Gerard Hastings stood to cross-examine, Catalina braced herself for the attack she knew was coming, but Hastings seemed to understand that anything he said would only make things worse. He asked a few perfunctory questions, trying to poke holes in her timeline or suggest she had exaggerated events, but his heart wasn't in it. After less than 30 minutes he sat down and Catalina was dismissed from the stand. The rest of the trial was almost anticlimactic. Richard's lawyers called character witnesses who fell apart under Diana's cross-examination. They tried to introduce evidence of Catalina's supposed instability, but Judge Holloway ruled it inadmissible after Diana argued it was victim-blaming dressed up as legal strategy. They attempted to cast doubt on Thomas Garrett's evidence, but the forensic experts Diana had hired demolished their claims. On the final day of testimony, Diana called John Coupland to the stand to talk about Isabel's death and the years he had spent trying to get justice for his wife. John's testimony was devastating in its simplicity. A man describing watching the woman he loved die because Richard had gotten her addicted to drugs and then abandoned her when she needed help most. When he finished, there wasn't a dry eye in the courtroom. The jury deliberated for 6 hours before returning with their verdict. Richard was found guilty on all counts. Multiple counts of first-degree murder, conspiracy, fraud, assault, and a dozen other charges that added up to multiple life sentences without possibility of parole. When the verdict was read, Richard's composure finally shattered completely. He screamed at Catalina, calling her every vile name he could think of, threatening her even as bailiffs restrained him. The judge had him gagged and removed from the courtroom, his muffled screams echoing through the halls long after the doors closed behind him. At sentencing 2 weeks later, Judge Holloway delivered a statement that would be quoted for years to come. "Mr. Walker, you are a predator who spent decades perfecting the art of destruction. You chose victims who you thought society wouldn't miss or wouldn't believe. You hid behind wealth and charm while destroying countless lives. But you made one critical mistake. You underestimated the strength of the women you tried to break. Catalina Jason survived you and exposed you, and because of her courage, you will spend the rest of your life in prison, knowing that a woman you considered weak and disposable was ultimately the one who destroyed you. I sentence you to life without parole on each count of murder, to be served consecutively. May you live long enough to regret every choice you've made." Outside the courthouse, media swarmed Diana, Catalina, and John with questions. Diana handled most of them, but when asked what justice meant to her after everything she'd been through, Catalina stepped forward to answer. "Justice doesn't bring back the women Richard killed. It doesn't undo the years of abuse or give me back my health or my parents. But it does mean that Richard will never hurt anyone else again. It means other women will see that fighting back is possible, that surviving is possible, that predators can be held accountable even when they seem untouchable. That's not perfect justice, but it's something. And sometimes something is enough." Chapter 10. The Woman Reborn. 1 year after Richard's conviction, Catalina stood in the gallery she had built from ruins and rage, surrounded by art that spoke to survival and transformation. The space had become something beyond what she initially imagined. Not just a gallery, but a sanctuary for women who had survived abuse and needed a place to reclaim their voices through creative expression. The walls showcased works by dozens of artists, each piece telling a story of pain transformed into power. John appeared beside her, his arm sliding around her waist with the easy familiarity of someone who had earned the right to be close. Their relationship had evolved slowly over the year, built on foundations of mutual respect and shared trauma rather than rush toward physical intimacy. They had both needed time to heal, to learn how to be people instead of weapons, and somehow they had managed to do it together. "You did this," John said quietly, gesturing to the crowded room, full of people celebrating the gallery's anniversary. "You took everything Richard tried to destroy and turned it into something that helps others survive." "We did this," Catalina corrected. "I couldn't have built any of this without your support." It was true. John had used his resources to help fund the gallery and the foundation Catalina had established for women escaping abusive relationships. Together, they had created a network of support that provided legal assistance, financial counseling, and safe housing for women trying to rebuild their lives. The work was exhausting and often heartbreaking, but it gave meaning to the suffering they had both endured. Elise approached them tentatively, and Catalina felt the familiar tightness in her chest that always accompanied interactions with her sister. Elise had served 18 months of her 5-year sentence before being granted early release to a halfway house, where she now worked as a counselor for other women dealing with guilt and complicity in crimes. Their relationship would never be what it once was. But over the past year, They had managed to build something new, fragile but honest. The exhibit is beautiful, Elise said, her eyes taking in the gallery with genuine appreciation. Mother and father would be proud of what you've built here. They would be proud of both of us for finding our way back to each other, Catalina replied, and meant it. Forgiveness was still difficult, and Elise's ankle monitor was a constant reminder of the consequences she was still serving. But healing didn't require forgetting, just choosing forward motion over perpetual anger. "How's the baby?" Catalina asked, because she always asked now, because her niece deserved an aunt who cared even if her mother had made terrible choices. "She's good. Your family has been amazing with her. I see her twice a week at the supervised visits, and she's starting to recognize me. The social worker thinks that by the time I'm fully released, we'll be ready for me to take custody again. You're working hard to earn that. I see the reports from your counselor. You're actually doing the work this time." Elise's eyes filled with tears. "I have to. I destroyed so much, hurt so many people. The least I can do is make sure my daughter grows up with a mother who takes responsibility for her actions and tries to do better." Diana arrived with news that made Catalina smile. Lawrence Thorne's appeal was denied. He's officially going to prison for conspiracy to commit murder. That makes 12 members of Richard's network who've been convicted in the past year. We're dismantling them piece by piece. The legal battles were far from over. Richard's associates were fighting their convictions with every resource available, but one by one they were losing. The network that had seemed so impenetrable was crumbling as more victims came forward and more evidence emerged. It would take years to completely dismantle, but the trajectory was clear. As the evening wore on and guests mingled, Catalina found herself drawn to a specific piece of art that held pride of place in the center of the main gallery. It was a portrait of her from the anniversary party, the moment she had handed Richard the gift box, but reimagined by an artist who had transformed the scene into something mythological. In the painting, Catalina glowed with inner fire, and Richard cowered before her like a demon confronted with holy light. "I still can't believe that was only a year ago," Catalina said to John as they stood together studying the painting. "It feels like a lifetime. You've lived multiple lifetimes in the past year. You've been a warrior, a survivor, a builder of new worlds. You've transformed from someone fighting for survival into someone helping others thrive." "I had good help," Catalina said, leaning into him. "I couldn't have done any of this alone." "You could have," John replied seriously. "You're the strongest person I've ever met, but I'm grateful you chose not to do it alone, that you let me be part of your journey." They stood together in comfortable silence until Diana approached with her phone held out. "You need to see this. It just came through from the prison." Catalina took the phone and read the message displayed on the screen. Richard Walker had died in prison, attacked by other inmates who had learned what he did to women. The death had been quick but not painless, and authorities were investigating, but hadn't made any arrests. Catalina handed the phone back to Diana and waited to feel something. Satisfaction, vindication, closure. Instead, she felt nothing but a hollow relief that he was gone. "Good," she said simply. "Now the women he killed can rest, knowing he's not breathing the same air anymore." She didn't mourn Richard's death. She didn't regret his suffering. She simply acknowledged it as the final chapter in a story that had consumed too much of her life already. And then she turned away from Diana's phone and back toward the gallery full of survivors who were building new lives from the ashes of their old ones. As the evening wound down and guests began to leave, John pulled Catalina aside into a quiet corner of the gallery. "I have something for you," he said, producing a small box from his jacket pocket. Catalina's heart began to race, but when she opened the box, it didn't contain a ring. Instead, there was a key on a simple chain. "What is this?" "It's a key to a house I bought for us. Not my estate with all its security and memories of attacks. Just a normal house in a neighborhood where we can be regular people instead of survivors constantly looking over our shoulders." I know we've talked about building a future together, and I thought maybe having a place that belongs to both of us, with no ghosts from our pasts, might be a good place to start. Catalina looked at the key, feeling tears prick her eyes for reasons that had nothing to do with sadness. You're asking me to move in with you. I'm asking you to build a life with me. A real life, not just an alliance against common enemies. I'm asking if you're ready to stop fighting long enough to see what we could be when we're not consumed by revenge. She thought about how far she had come in a year, from the broken woman standing in that ballroom to the person she was now. She thought about all the work still ahead, all the women who needed help, all the battles yet to be fought. But she also thought about the possibility of joy, of mornings waking up beside someone who loved her, not despite her damage, but because of the strength she had forged from it. Yes, Catalina said, closing her hand around the key. Yes, I'm ready to stop fighting and start living. John kissed her then, and it felt like a promise of futures she had thought were impossible when Richard controlled her life. It felt like hope. As they left the gallery together, Catalina looked back one final time at the portrait of herself from the anniversary party. That woman had been powerful and frightening, and absolutely committed to destruction. The woman she was now was softer somehow, more open to possibility, but no less strong. She had learned that survival wasn't the same as living, that winning battles wasn't the same as finding peace, that destroying your enemies wasn't the same as building something beautiful. She had declared war on Richard and won decisively. Now she was ready to declare peace with herself and see what miracles that might create. The future stretched before her, uncertain but full of promise. And for the first time since her wedding night, Catalina Jason looked toward tomorrow with something that felt remarkably like joy.